Politics Live.
It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. A first phone call between the new American president and the Prime Minister. Can the warm words last? As America realigns politically, what does it mean for Britain and Europe? Also today...
Why optimism for Britain has never burned brighter than it does now, and that's why we are going further and faster.
Positive words, but high street businesses are facing a tough future. This business owner will tell us what he wants the Chancellor to do about it.
Happy to be staying put, Mr. Heseltine?
And what advice would this big beast give to those trying to survive in today's political jungle? Joining us today, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Labour's Emily Thornberry, Conservative peer Lord Heseltine, New Statesman columnist and former editor of The Mirror, Alison Phillips, and Times columnist Fraser Nelson. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Let's start with this headline in the Daily Telegraph. As you heard in the headlines, Trump expected to visit Britain soon after first call with Starmer since inauguration. The Prime Minister becomes first European leader to speak to the US President since he was sworn in, no doubt much to the delight of number 10. As expressed in this tweet from the Prime Minister, I spoke with the President of the United States today and congratulated him on his inauguration. I thanked him for his kind words on the loss of my brother. We discussed the importance of working together for security in the Middle East, for trade and economic growth. I look forward to meeting soon to strengthen the close ties between our countries. And President Trump was recorded on board Air Force One talking about his relationship with Keir Starmer. Let's have a listen.
He's done a very good job thus far. He's very new in the job, but he's represented his country in terms of his philosophy. I may not agree with his philosophy, but I have a very good relationship with him. I've seen him twice, had dinner with him in Trump Tower, as you probably know. You know that, right?
Well, you heard there Donald Trump saying that he can have a very good relationship with Keir Starmer, despite their different philosophies. Starting with you, Emily, is he right?
Well, it's important that we do. America is a very big force in the world, and we have to work with them. There's a whole range of things we need to work with them on. But we need to remain true to ourselves at the same time. So it's a question of getting that balance right, really.
Right. I mean, how will Keir Starmer go about that, bearing in mind they do have very different philosophies on all sorts of things?
So I think what you need to do is you need to find out where your interests align with the president's. So, for example, on Ukraine, he wants peace, we want peace, he wants a deal, we want a deal, but we have to be clear that we don't want a loser's deal. And it needs to be clear to him what a loser's deal looks like. And he doesn't want to be negotiating a loser's deal. So I think that's the approach. I think that on the Middle East, I think that there is work to be done by a range of nations, and I think Britain has a role in that, in terms of moving forward and a peace settlement in Palestine. And I think that the Americans can play a really important role in that, but perhaps some of the heavy lifting will be done elsewhere, and we need to work with them.
Michael Heseltine, Donald Trump says that Keir Starmer's doing a good job. Is he right?
Look, we live in a grown-up world. It's very important that people at the top of the various governments get on to the point at which they can have civilised conversations. And so, although they will all be briefed about the prejudices and attitudes of each other by their embassies and their foreign service, the important thing, whether it's America or China or any other of the great nations, is to be able to sit down and talk as opposed to shout or not talk at all. And that's what you're now seeing. It's the opening flirtation. It's precedented a million times. It doesn't tell us anything about the real issues that are facing. Is Trump going to impose tariffs on this country?
Well, we'll come on to that in a moment. But do you think it can last?
Is he going to try and annex Greenland? Or the Panama Canal?
Well, absolutely.
I don't know.
Can it last, though, these warm words? You call it the opening flirtation. Can those warm words last between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer?
Civilised conversations can last. I mean, there are many people with whom I disapprove of in political power. I hope I've always been able to talk to them and listen to what they have to say.
Alison, do you think there can be a very good relationship between the President of the United States and the Labour Prime Minister here?
I think there can. I think perhaps one of the best things maybe that Keir Starmer's ever done in his political career was being really quickly on the phone after that assassination attempt. Do you remember? He was one of the first people to call Donald Trump. And we're talking about a leader who it's very much around the person and the personality. And I think if they can get a very good person-to-person relationship going, that will help when inevitably there are going to be bumps along the road between what Keir Starmer thinks is best for this country and what Donald Trump thinks is best for America.
And what do you think about him saying he's done a very good job, Keir Starmer?
Well, I don't think Donald Trump actually believes that, but he's been polite. But the most important thing is this phone call to Starmer came before he spoke to any other leader in Europe. Number 10 will have, from the get-go, wanted to be in that queue. It's hard to say to overstate just how much importance they place on that, thinking special relationship means that we're the first phone call. And so it was. So now and again there is talk that, the relationship's so bad that maybe Nigel Farage should go in there to be the ambassador, to be a bridge. As it turns out, the British Foreign Office and our diplomats have done a pretty good job on getting this phone call.
Right, well, in terms of that, if that is the basis for those conversations on things like tariffs, which is what the government is most worried about, where does Keir Starmer and the government go from here in order to prevent that happening? We've had the UK, this is the business secretary, should be excluded from the tariffs Donald Trump is threatening to impose on exports to the US, as Johnny Reynolds said to the BBC. But how will they stop him?
I think the first thing that we have to put into the mix is that we have a government that's been elected for 5 years, possibly for 10 years. We will be stability on the international stage, where most incumbent governments are tumbling. And in 2 years' time, Keir Starmer will be an elder statesman. And I think that if Donald Trump is being briefed, he will know that he has to have a long-standing relationship with the British Prime Minister. Many of the other leaders may come and go. So that's kind of number one. Number two is, why do you use tariffs? You use tariffs if you want to apply pressure to a country to get them to behave in a different way.
Well, as we've seen very strikingly with Colombia.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so the question is, in what way does he want Britain to behave in a different way? The truth is that Britain invests into the United States more than, I think, any other country. There's billions of pounds going on. There's 2 million people getting their jobs because of British investment. We already have a very healthy trading relationship with the United States and vice versa. So you kind of think, well, what do you want?
Michael Heseltine, what do you think in terms of the approach?
You have to be frank. I think we have to recognise that we have an important relationship with Europe, and that if Donald Trump is going to single out Europe as part of his target, that's singling out us as well, because we are interrelated with the European economy. And I think that you have to remember the MAGA, Make America Great Again. This is all about a populist appeal to a certain section of American opinion based on the prejudices about immigration, about economic frustration, and it's all about pandering to that group tend to be rather right-wing, and therefore people who would not be natural allies of mine.
Although he won very decisively in that sense, didn't he, Donald Trump, in the election?
That merely reinforces my anxieties.
Right. I mean,
because there is sweeping the world a deep memory of the 1930s. Economic hardship, the contrast between fascism and communism. And that is being exploited by leader after leader in this country, in Europe and in America. These are very dangerous times we live in.
Well, how do you see it, Fraser, in response to what you've just heard from Michael Heseltine?
I wouldn't compare it to the 1930s. I would say that the world is moving away from the free trade model more towards the tariffs. Now, that's unfortunate for us because Brexit was a vote to engage more in free trade, and we found out that there aren't as many willing partners as we would have liked. At one stage, it did look like America was going to come and do a free trade deal with Britain.
That looks less likely.
But the dilemma that Keir Starmer's got now is, does he threaten to retaliate? If you look at what Pierre Poilievre, the next Canadian Prime Minister, is saying, he's saying, look, if the US puts sanctions on us, we're going to hit the US where it hurts as well. We're going to do X, Y and Z. Now, this is escalatory language. Now, of course, Britain would have to say it's a very delicate negotiation. We don't want these tariffs, but I guess at some point it's going to have to say...
But the tariffs are only used if you want something. So the question is, what is it that he would want from Britain that he doesn't already have? You know, we already have a good relationship with the Americans, whoever the president is. So what additional pressure would he want to put on the UK? I mean, some people, you know, he has complaints against some Europeans. They don't spend enough on defence. We're spending enough on defence. You know, so what in particular? You know, I mean, I think the talk of tariffs, I think we need to kind of breathe and not get too kind of wound up by it.
Well, in terms of being wound up, what would you say, though, to Fraser saying that the UK could retaliate? Is that what you would advocate, or some sort of retaliation from the EU?
There have been tariffs in the past. There's been an argument about aircraft parts and whiskey, I remember, and so they were very limited and they were on a particular point of dispute. But as I say, I don't think that Britain is a country that Donald Trump will feel that he wants or needs to put particular pressure on, because he doesn't have a row with us.
Right. Is there now an opportunity to move closer to the EU in the way the government has been talking about very broadly? Even Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservatives, has said mistakes were made in the post-Brexit planning for growth. So should the UK tilt towards the EU more robustly than it has done?
Well, certainly, if we're going to follow this mission for growth, there is no doubt that Brexit has caused a real blockage in that attempt to get to that growth. And so we are going to have to look at ways that some of that can be unpicked. We have to, I believe that we have to remain respectful of the vote that we had not that long ago, and that we cannot go back to a full customs union, but there is still movement that we can make that would help in this pursuit of growth.
Well, do you agree with that, Fraser? In the UK could sign up to EU trade scheme for softer Brexit. We've heard from Markus Sefcovic about a pan-European trading system. The Liberal Democrats want a full customs union. Is that the direction of travel that we should be pursuing?
Well, I would love for us to have tariff-free relationship with the EU. If they would have it with us, it'd be within our interest and their interest. The problem always is, but the price the EU would ask in return for it is one that we democratically can't pay. They want, for example, visa-free access to the under-25s or whatever. They're normally the bargain, which there shouldn't be a bargain. I mean, both sides benefit from free trade, but there's always a price which goes beyond what we would see as consistent with our sovereign powers.
Is that price beyond what we'd be prepared to do? Michael Heseltine should do if it's a youth mobility scheme on the one hand?
I think that the creation of the single market was Margaret Thatcher's greatest achievement. And it was a culmination of the determination that war should be eliminated from the landmass of Europe. I was rather keen on these ideas, and I am appalled by Brexit. I don't believe for an instant that we should accept the verdict of a pack of lies which was paraded by various people in order to persuade people that we had to sever our relationship with Europe.
But that was a vote in 2016. We did leave in 2019. Now, looking at it, how far would you advocate getting closer to the EU in economic terms?
Straight down the line, I would go back into Europe, to the heart of Europe. And do you know why? Because I believe it is in the best interests of a generation of young British people.
Do you agree, Emily?
I campaigned very hard to remain in the European Union, but I lost. And so I have to kind of come to terms with that. And right now, what we need to do is remember that this deal was signed on Christmas Eve by Boris Johnson. Not a surprise to hear that it was a deal that had all sorts of holes in it. Within the deal, there are methods for repairing those holes. We need to make sure that we do. There are a whole load of things. I mean, like, we're a service economy. I mean, the deal had nothing to do with services. I mean, it's ridiculous, you know, that we had a trade agreement with the European Union to leave the European Union that didn't deal with our service economy, for example.
But, Michael?
This question of we voted in 2016, the deal is done. What is democracy about? I have lived through generation after generation where Conservatives have opposed Labour nationalisation programmes. We undid them, and we said we would undo them despite the fact they had a mandate.
But then we have a referendum, which rather changes the conversation somewhat. If you do have a referendum, then it's pretty difficult to say, actually, we're going to change your mind a few years later. I mean, you could argue that referendums are the wrong way of going about it, but we had a referendum on Scottish independence, for example. I mean, these are pretty big, these are things that you don't really want to repeat, but it's difficult to ignore.
Right.
May I also-
why
may-
can't you have another referendum?
Well,
May I say...
Put it to the British people.
I'd love to know what the appetite is for a second referendum.
I mean,
Look, you've got all the polls indicating clearly now that people know that they were hoodwinked, they were deceived.
I haven't seen the polls backing a second referendum.
The majority is now in favour
well, there are
of
certainly
joining
polls,
with Europe.
certainly polls saying a closer relationship. What
Yes,
that may
absolutely.
entail.
I like that.
But let me.
I think there's also huge dangers, unfortunately, if we were to go back to another referendum or to reheat this whole conversation. All those people who are feeling they're being misrepresented by those people in power, it would just create even more anger of those forces of populism. I fear it may just encourage them.
Can I also say, I mean, there's another side to this, which is, does the European Union want Britain to have another referendum and another series of negotiations to get back into the European Union? I think, given how disruptive us leaving was, I suspect that whilst they want an improved relationship, they don't want to go through the whole thing all over again.
And they want us to accept free movement, the Maastricht vertical deficits, things that the public simply wouldn't support.
And what about then with President Trump in the White House? Does it complicate matters in terms of our future relationship with Europe? Simon Fraser, the former permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, told the BBC over the weekend that our relationships with the EU and the US will become more complicated with the return of President Trump. He said there is a risk of conflict and tension between the EU and the US, and we will be caught somewhere in the middle of that. Is he right?
Yeah, he might be. I think
Of course he's right. But we have to be very clear what our purpose is, and it's British self-interest. And we are a European power. We always have been a European power, and there are tensions with the Atlantic relationship. And I personally am a great admirer of Pax Americana, but that doesn't mean to say that I think that Britain's interests are American interests.
Right. Well, Emily, are you right that actually you should
things-
perhaps risk upsetting Donald Trump and the US administration by embracing that closer relationship economically with the EU?
I don't think it has to be that you upset them by embracing a closer relationship. We need to have a closer relationship. Our agreement is not complete, and there's more work that needs to be done. That's that.
What are you going to say as a government if Trump threatens military action to achieve power in Greenland?
Well, that's a different issue.
No, it's not
So,
a different issue. It is a fundamental issue where the President of the United States has threatened to use force to acquire Greenland.
So it's a different issue because the first issue is, should we have a closer economic relationship with the European Union? And the second issue, with respect, sir, is that it's about the nature of NATO and the fact that you would have one NATO country threatening other NATO countries. The question is, would it really ever happen? I don't believe it would. I think that, certainly there's no reason why particularly the Inuits should be asked whether or not they would want to have. They already have one base. Would they like to have a larger base with regard to America, particularly if there are more jobs coming from it? I mean, that's the kind of conversation that one needs to have. I don't think we need to catastrophise necessarily. Yeah. I may be wrong, but I think it's best to approach this optimistically.
Well, I heard all this in 1938. It won't happen. Peace in our time.
Well, let me put another scenario to you, and that is on another aspect of foreign affairs, because if we look at these rather striking pictures and images from Gaza of Palestinians returning along the coast there, you can see on the beach trying to get back to northern Gaza after the ceasefire, which is rather fragile. We hear this from President Trump in the BBC News headline, saying Trump wants Arab neighbours to take in over 1 million Palestinians to clean out Gaza. He said it was a demolition site. Is that a policy you could support, Emily?
No, certainly not.
Right.
I think that there needs to be investment and rebuilding of Gaza, but that will only happen if there is a proper peace process. Nobody's going to want to invest in Gaza if it's going to get bombed again in a couple of years. So there has to be a proper peace process, and in that way there would be confidence in countries that would be prepared to invest in, like, for example, like Saudi Arabia, who would be prepared to invest in Gaza, but only if we're on a solid path to a two-state, and they're completely open about that. And
but how worried are you about that? If you don't agree with that policy suggestion, how worried are you that Donald Trump has spelt it out in that way? I mean, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State in the US, I don't think has spoken to the Foreign Secretary here, David Lammy, as yet. What do you think he should say, the Foreign Secretary, if that is the conversation?
I think that there is a lot of conversation that needs to happen, and I suspect, as I said at the beginning of this programme, that there is work that many nations would be prepared to do to try to put us onto a path towards peace, and America would play a part in that. And I think that it's simply not a solution to empty Gaza. I'm obviously really concerned about what's happening on the West Bank as well.
The key with Donald Trump is to take him seriously, but not literally.
Not literally.
He's not literally going to invade Greenland. I don't think he literally meant what he says there. Now, this is how he speaks. He thinks out loud. And I think we're all going to have to get into the habit when we hear things like that, not really analysing it as if it's a serious suggestion. You'll always have to wait to see it settled, to see what his administration says. And it's usually less crazy than what he's saying.
I completely agree with Fraser, but also I think that point that Lord Heseltine made is that we know that things happened in the 1930s very, very gradually, very moment by moment. There's not just one big moment, everything changes. So I completely agree. I think he says things that he doesn't actually going to do, but we have to be alive to the fact that one day something may happen.
All right, let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Mail. Businesses brace for job cuts as budget tax rises start to bite. Situation is urgent, the Confederation of British Industry tells Labour. It's a membership organisation, the CBI, with many small businesses. They've surveyed 990 firms between December and January, and the survey said that businesses were predicting a significant fall in economic activity in the next 3 months. Now, to help businesses, the CBI is calling on the government to reform the business rate system, the levy charged on the value of commercial properties. Let's speak to Stuart Phillips. He runs the 100 House Hotel in Telford in Shropshire with his family, and the family have owned it since 1986. Welcome to you, Stuart. In April, business rate relief is going to be cut from 75 to 40%. What impact will that have on your business?
Well, it'll make it more tricky. We'll go from paying around 18,000 to 35,000 in business rates, and along with lots of other increases in running the business, it's just going to make it more difficult. I mean, we've been here 38 years, so we've seen lots of ups and downs. So we're getting prepared for it. But I wouldn't like to be starting out as a business. And obviously, there's other increases coming in too in April.
Right, yes. What are the other things that you are talking about when you say there are different aspects of the business that you're having to deal with?
Well, running a pub restaurant, especially an independent one where we make everything from scratch, it's very craft orientated. We spend a lot of time training people. We get them up to a great standard. And, you know, the new national insurance costs will penalise us by about £40,000 to £50,000. We have about 20 full-time staff, and we like to try and retain our team. So many of them have hit the 21 minimum wage, and then the increase on the NICs is another burden. And the fact it starts at 5,000 is a big blow.
Right, the threshold at which employers... Well, it's a big blow. I mean, Emily, what do you say to Stuart and no doubt other businesses having to deal with, yes, business rate relief is going to be cut, the increase in national insurance for employers and the Employment Rights Bill? Let's park that for a moment, but let's look at the other two.
So there's 40% business rate relief for retail, hospitality and leisure. That should be helped you. In fact, Stuart.
But it's been cut from 75% to 40% in April because it went up during the pandemic to 75%. Now it's going to be cut. He's going to have to pay far more.
Well, I mean, I think that to get the business rate relief for these particular industries is important, and it's a recognition that those businesses have particularly been suffering. So I think maintaining it at 40% is certainly an advantage. I think there are a number of other assistances that are there, and in the end, I think hard decisions have to be made, and it is in the interest of business for there to be schools that are properly invested in so that people coming in to work in the business are properly educated. If they get sick, they can go to hospital, they can see a GP rapidly, that there's money put into infrastructure. We're all going to need to pay for that, and we need to kind of share that burden, I'm afraid.
Well, Stuart, are you prepared to do that?
Oh, we're definitely prepared to contribute. But I think another worry is, like, we're in Shropshire, and I think rural communities will see pubs close. I mean, if you think the average pub now is paying about 8,000 to 9,000 business rates, that sounds very small, but pubs they make hardly any money. So that might go to 12,000. So that might be the landlord and landlady's holiday wiped out for the year. So I think it could really hit like less urban areas and less busy premises.
Right. I mean, what do you say, Emily, in terms of the push for growth by the government? I mean, what we're hearing here is the struggle to keep on staff, certainly not taking on any more, and businesses closing.
I mean, there have been other surveys as well. I mean, PwC did a survey of 5,000 chief executives, and Britain was in second place in the world when it came to the place to invest in, and that's because of a confidence that Britain is going to be growing. I mean, the IMF has said that our growth rate is going to be 1.6% in the next year. That's a lot better than an awful lot of other countries.
All right. Well,
I mean, all of this is good news. I appreciate that, particularly the increase in national insurance has really hit businesses, particularly, although obviously, the smallest businesses, those that employ 4 people or less, are excluded from that. And
let me bring in
businesses won't therefore be paying.
Let me bring in our other guest. I mean, Michael Heseltine, you've also, as well as being a politician, you have been a businessman. I mean, listening to Stuart now, particularly with the increases in national insurance, what advice would you give him and the government in terms of the decisions they've made when they still want to push for growth in the economy?
Well, to him, I have to say that I understand your problem, but you're in business, you've got to find a way through. And at the present moment with the government, you've had burdens placed on you which make that difficult. I can sympathise, but you do not have the power to do anything about that. If I were talking to the government, which is a very different story, they started off by explaining what a terrible state the economy was in, and people came to understand that. Then they taxed employment, and it's not surprising, therefore the industrial, commercial people are going to employ less people. Devastating. They attacked the small and medium-sized privately owned companies. I happen to be one. And I am shattered that the decisions we now have to think about, floating the company, selling the company, or restraining the activities of the company to stop higher levels of taxation, and using dividends, which we want to use to grow, in order to pay the inheritance tax, taking it out in dividends, paying the tax on the dividends. It is a shattering indictment of all that matters in the small and medium-sized family business. But that's a personal cry.
Right. Well, let me get Emily.
Just before we get off, the big thing is to get the economy growing, and they're using the language, but they're not taking the decisions. And we can get on to that subject, on which I have very strong views based on long experience, but that's not the agenda that you're talking about at this minute.
Right. I think that the difference is that with the new government there is a plan. There is a plan for getting investment into the country. There's a plan for investing in infrastructure, for decarbonising our economy. I mean, all of these things are important. And whilst I have every sympathy for Stuart and the problems that he's facing, the truth is that 50% of small businesses are paying less in terms of national insurance because of the small business relief. I mean, but look at the other side. There's been £63 billion came in at the time of the Foreign Investment Summit. Recently, when we were talking about AI, there was also another announcement of another 14 billion that came in. I mean, money is coming into the country. People do have confidence, and internationally, people are looking towards Britain and thinking, this is a country which is going somewhere, and that's what we need.
If only. I mean, one thing is very clear, that before the election, Keir Starmer says he wants employment at 80%. That's still his goal, by the way. That would mean 2 million more jobs. Now, the big question was, what's the plan to grow the economy? What's the plan to get these jobs? And instead, we have a plan that's going to send jobs the other way. I mean, we've just heard there how they're going to be happening in pubs, in Lord Heseltine's company, in companies right around. Of course, they can find a way through. But to get a way through, that means they hire fewer people, they invest a little bit less. So when you look at the overall trajectory of this, it is not towards employment growth in the way the government had led us to believe. It's not even towards economic growth, not more than what we inherited anyway from the Conservatives. So there's a bit of a gap where the growth plan is, and this is why Rachel Reeves is going to end up talking about Heathrow Expansion or other things like this, which are a very poor substitute for the jobs increase which will...
Last week, the £9 billion that Rolls-Royce invested will result in thousands of jobs. I mean, it's not right to say that that jobs are shrinking. The investment results in jobs, and that's what we need to do. And we need to take the economy by the scruff of the neck, and we need to make sure that our country's going in the right direction. And we need to start making some decisions about infrastructure in a way that we just simply haven't. I mean, look at the changes that are going to be made so that people can't keep taking infrastructure projects to court and holding it up for years and years. I mean, that's got to be right.
Right. Well, but politically, we're still
to say yes.
We're still talking about the fallout from the budget. These changes, some of them are coming in April, and now there is the business rate relief that is going to be cut. I don't think it did come in until 2020. So before that, presumably, Stuart and others were paying higher amounts on business rates. But just politically, for Labour, as it tries to go and turbo boost its plan for growth, how's it going?
Well, there's two things going on at the same time. We're having all this talk about investment and growth, and there has been some real positive noises since Christmas, really. When I think, because in the run-up to Christmas, there was an acceptance that really business had lost a lot of faith in the government, and so there is a lot of good news. We're going to have the buildings going to be going, the deregulation in some areas, Heathrow, Gatwick, commuter towns, all this sort of stuff. That's great. But I think, as we've seen here from your caller, in the here and now, there are a lot of people really, really struggling, and they're having to lay people off. The only good thing, I think, is that we are, at some point, within this Parliament, going to have people with more money in their pockets to spend in pubs and restaurants and shops, and that hopefully will start to filter through.
Well, do you share that? You share that, Stuart?
Well, I think most pubs and restaurants will automatically have to put up the prices, which will probably inhibit extra sales. And about the 50% of businesses that will be paying less national insurance. It's never very transparent, this. I've never seen the list of businesses, and I don't know anybody in business myself.
If you know of business people who employ 4 people or less, they're the ones who won't be. That's so, and most businesses in this country are really small.
Yeah, but it's not yours, I'm afraid.
Not yours.
In this case.
There is an argument there as well, in that hasn't really probably been communicated as effectively as it should have done. Because that is an interesting point, isn't it?
Right. Is it about the choreography and the sort of presentation of these issues?
No, I'm afraid to say, when you look at it, actually, the more you look, the worse it gets. I mean, for example, freezing off the tax thresholds. I mean, that every single year, somebody on the minimum wage is going to be giving a greater share of their income to tax. And that is going to get worse and worse every single year of this Parliament. There is not going to be, sadly, more spending power for those at the bottom, and there should be. You think the point of a progressive Labour government was to have more workers and to let them keep more of their money. Neither of those two things.
Well, the national minimum wage is going up by 6%. I mean, it is going up quite a lot, actually, and wages themselves have been going up quite a lot.
So is the tax rates. So are the thresholds, effectively.
Well, I'm going to just say goodbye to Stuart Phillips. Thank you for joining us, and good luck, obviously, with the business, because I just want to draw your attention to this headline. Michael Heseltine said, let's talk about some of the substantive issues on growth. Do you support third runway at Heathrow?
Oh, yes, this is a scandal. It has been in the make for decades.
Yes.
Of course we should. If you don't have... What happens if you don't expand Heathrow is that the new markets don't get served from London because we're at capacity. And therefore, whether they go, they switch to Europe. And, we're in a competitive world. So... But I just can't... We've been listening to the small businesses and how under 4 people they have special privileges. What are you saying? If you've got a small business, stay at 4. That is exactly what you don't want them to do. You want them to expand. Immediately they cross the threshold, the bills go up.
Well, Emily, that's true.
Absolutely. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and obviously the problem with all of these things always is the cut-off, and it can't apply to everyone. And if we applied it to 8, then the moment that the business got more than 8, then they would get hit as well. I mean, it's you have to put a line somewhere.
Right. And are you
given that the majority of small businesses are that small, and 50% of business in the country will be, I mean, it seems like a threshold that makes sense.
On the small business, we are very good at creating small businesses. We are not good at turning small businesses into medium businesses. That is a problem, coupled with the very difficult productivity achievements in this country. These are real problems which need to be addressed.
Well, and on Heathrow, do you agree with Michael Heseltine? Go ahead, finally, with that third runway at Heathrow or not?
No, I think in the run-up to the election, we had 4 tests and that we needed to hold any potential expansion of Heathrow against the test of what effect it would have on air quality, what effect it would have on our commitments on carbon.
And if they're all met, you're happy with it?
If they're all met, but the difficulty has always been, would they all be met, particularly if we also went for expansion of Gatwick, if we went expansion of Luton. And, you know, there is a limit to the amount of expansion
so
that
you're
we
agreeing
can
really
make.
with the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, against the idea of Heathrow expansion? A blocker, as the government itself would call you.
I have concerns about the expansion of Heathrow, and I'm a Londoner. I mean, why would I not?
Right.
But also, I think and I think it's also, you know, to the extent to which Heathrow is to be used as a hub. So people getting off a plane and getting on another one at Heathrow, not staying in the UK, but going off somewhere else. And the extent to which, you know, people have to remember the extent to which Heathrow is a hub and whether another runway would just make it a larger hub. I mean, all of these things that need to be factored in, and that's why we have, as I say, the tests that we have, and we need to apply them scrupulously.
Well, I mean, it sounds as if the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is going to throw her support or approve at least a runway. Of course, the Conservatives could have done it in the last few governments, but also it didn't get
and the
through.
Labour Party before that.
And it goes on and on. And while we're talking about political and economic history, let's go back to the 1980s. Michael Heseltine, you've written a book from acorns to oaks, get it the right way round. And in it, you talk about the best way, the policies that you have supported, increasing prosperity, driving growth, restoring hope, the creation of devolution, directly elected mayors, which has happened. And we can show you here in Toxteth, because this was after the riots in Liverpool, in favour, of course, of regeneration of big cities, Liverpool in Merseyside, parts of London's East End and central Manchester. You've heard Emily say that she has concerns about things like the third runway at Heathrow. But are you broadly signed up to the government's agenda to bulldoze through planning and get on with trying to do big infrastructure projects?
I'm a bore on this subject.
Don't say that first.
I first became involved in the 1960s when the last serious analysis of the problems of Britain's ineffective economy was produced in a report by Redcliffe Maud. He looked at 1,300 authorities and he said it's got to go down to 60. We've got down to 300. And there are now clearest possible indications as to what needs to be done. And in my book, I set out the steps over those many decades, little by little, in which government after government have moved. But they have not learnt the lessons, which means you need to plan economies from the local area, involving the local people, the industry, the universities, the local authorities, the quangos, and you need to evolve a strategy based on the real world. We have a strategy where separate functional departments, transport, health, housing, tell people what to do. And that is not compatible with the growth agenda. Second thing, you have to give them incentives locally. There is £10 billion in the Public Accounts Committee today. Public Accounts, not Committee. Public Accounts.
I was going to say they're well off the Public Accounts.
£10 billion, which could be made available for local strategic plans to bid. And by doing that, it doesn't cost you any more money, but you can make a condition that the local people have to show how there would be additional money as a consequence.
Do you think
we have proved that this works. George Osborne began with a £2 billion a year fund. This government has cut that, and now there are debates going on about whether or not we should actually entrust and enthuse those local communities.
Well, do you think Kemi Badenoch, the newish leader of the Conservative Party, will embrace those things?
It doesn't matter what Kenny does. I mean, she is irrelevant in terms of this decision. She will not be in power for 5 years. We have not got 5 years to waste making these decisions. This is a matter for Keir Starmer, his government, and the decisions needs to be done now. The
Right.
agenda is
all right.
now
Well,
unfolding.
that's you're throwing the gauntlet down to the government, but doesn't it matter where the Conservative Party, where your party is and what it's saying on these things? I mean, Kemi Badenoch's been very clear she wants to have a smaller state. She hasn't set out how.
Look, we've been through all that stuff.
Have we?
This was the argument of the Thatcher regime in the 1980s. I privatised more of the public sector than any other minister in history. And so I know about the virtues and desirability of privatisation. What I also learnt, and you showed the story, Liverpool, is the interdependence of the private sector and the public sector. And if you've got to get them to work together, and you've got to do it locally, and you've got to offer them an incentive to make it possible for them to do it.
Fraser?
The point Kemi Badenoch is making is that the size of his state now, the tax burden supporting it, is pretty much at a post-war high. And it's not like the 1980s. It's not because the government owns lots of industries. I mean, if you look at, we saw some video there from, I think it was 1981 after Toxteth, and when you look at the number of people in out-of-work benefits now, it is greater now than it was then. We're supporting almost 6 million people in out-of-work benefits. 3.5 million of them on sickness benefits. That's going to rise to 4.1 million in a few years' time. That is what is the double whammy of welfare costs and depriving the economy of workers. I mean, that is how you get the economy growing and the bills down.
All of that is run by a London department. And I agree with your concern, we've got far too many people living on the state, and the only way I can see of actually addressing the issue is to create a local responsibility for the administration of these welfare programmes.
Sure, but that's how you shrink the government, that's how you shrink bills, that's how you get people working again. I don't think the privatisation was the yesteryear's agenda. Right now, there's so many reforms we can do to get government more efficient and most of all get people...
Start telling me what they are.
Well, before you do, you also say in your book that the Conservative Party can't win again, can't win an election if it lurches to the right. Is that what it's doing?
It's what the whole political system is doing in this country and across Europe. What do you think Mr. Trump is all about when he says the immigrants are all criminals and all this sort of stuff? What do you think Farage is doing when he's talking about getting our country back? It's all about racial hatred, racial tensions. We saw it with the Jews in the 1930s. We saw it with Enoch Powell in the 1960s. And we have now got a new version of it across Europe and in America.
Right.
And I tell you this, the Conservative Party will not come back to power if it panders to the likes of Nigel Farage.
I think the comparisons with 1930s are always unhelpful. I mean, right now people are concerned about border control. This isn't anti-immigrant. 1 in 5 British workers is an immigrant now. Immigrants are fundamentally part of this country. But even immigrants will tell you that they're very concerned about the way immigration policy has been going. As they are in America, look at the American border. They were quite right to be concerned at the number of illegal crossings. Now, it is possible to be concerned about that, to want the law to be implemented fairly, to wish immigration to come fairly, and not be racist or xenophobic.
Right.
I think that's where most people are. And we need to, I think, accept that to hear what people are saying.
But does that mean that the Conservative Party under Kemi Badenoch, I mean, they were behind in the latest poll, behind reform, does that mean that there does need to be some sort of consideration about what Reform UK are doing?
The difficulty I think Kemi Badenoch has now is she is trying to ape the behaviours of Nigel Farage, but politically, is that really going to work? Because yes, there's a huge number of people they've got concerns about immigration, they've got concerns about economically, which is why we keep coming back to growth, because until that point that people are starting to feel better off, you're not going to deal with that, and we also have to deal with immigration as a country. But for Kemi Badenoch, the language of the extreme right isn't necessarily going to be giving her the votes that she's going to need to get that coalition that's going to get her anywhere near power.
And to taking it back to Trump, I think also, again, the polling shows that in all the countries in the world, Trump is least popular in the UK than he is anywhere else, because people don't believe that sort of politics is there.
Of language, I do think there is some very implicit language, as you say, Lord Heseltine, absolutely. But I think the Conservatives can show that they understand people's concerns and will act on them without being accused of pandering to racism.
All right, that's all we have time for, I'm afraid.
It doesn't alienate a serious body of support to the centre ground.
Time for a new conversation, that's all we have time for. Goodbye.
The Hammonds are here. I'm hitting the Florida highways with my